More than 8.4 million containers have moved through the Port of Los Angeles so far this year. That's up more than 19% from last year. Q3 of this year was the port's busiest quarter ever. But the possibility of new tariffs under President-elect Donald Trump could have an effect on imports at the two busiest ports in the country, LA and Long Beach. Joining me now is someone who understands all this very well. It is the executive director of the Port of Los Angeles, Gene Seroka. Gene, welcome back to Inside the Issues. Great to have you in here.
Nice to see you again, Amrit.
Well, tell me if I got all those numbers right there, but it seems like it's banner time, and it has been for a minute there at the port in terms of imports and the cargo you're processing.
Yeah, as usual, your numbers are spot on. Underlying this is a strong U.S. economy. We continue to buy, manufacturers are doing well, but also a couple geopolitical issues. There's been drought conditions in the Panama Canal for the past couple of years, pushing more cargo our way. The Houthi rebels and security issues in the Red Sea have also forced cargo to come through the Southern California gateways. And then more recently, protracted labor negotiations by dock workers on the East and Gulf Coast. So you take all these issues and just fractional amounts of cargo moving our way, keep this volume elevated for an extended period of time in Los Angeles and Long Beach.
That's really interesting. A lot of those things, of course, predate what happened in November. But in November, a new president-elect has been elected. It is Donald Trump, and he has a lot of ideas about tariffs. These are things that we'll talk about. But we're seeing a run-up in cargo in anticipation of this at the very least, right?
Absolutely. And a lot of importers are telling me that just in case tariffs are implemented at certain levels that have been discussed, they wanted to build up inventories and bring their average cost per unit down. So that's a real happening today.
Yeah, so let's talk a bit about what your take, what the port's take, what the impact of these tariffs might be. All kinds of plans coming from President-elect Trump, 10% across the board, 25% for Canada, Mexico, China, for different reasons, right? An additional 10% on what's already there in China. But what will it mean for consumers, in your estimation? And what will it mean, more importantly, to you for the port?
Interestingly enough, what I've learned thus far is what happens on the campaign trail is a little bit different than what may happen legislatively or for policy, yet we're not dismissing anything. In its purest form, taken at the surface, tariffs of this magnitude will create inflation. It'll cost more for you and me when we go to the store, when we're buying goods. If that happens, and China is in the bullseye of these tariffs, you'll see more and more cargo migrating to Southeast Asian and South Asian nations for production. And we saw this during the first administration. In fact, at the end of 2022, our portfolio, 57% of all the cargo that moved through the Port of LA emanated from China. Today, it's 43% and continues to go down just a little bit. More tariffs on top of that will force companies to look at China +1, +2 sourcing mechanisms.
Let's talk about the inflation point for a second, because it stands to reason that tariffs, as you have said, essentially function as a tax on customers. They get passed on to the customers. And so the price for some of these goods will be inflated to customers. There's inflation there. But the Trump campaign is saying, look, I mean, this is going to drive revenues for the country. This is going to mean cheaper goods that are domestic, perhaps, and might mean better wages for American workers who can then afford those goods. So maybe the inflationary effects won't be exactly as deleterious as suggested. What do you say to that?
Possible scenario, but doubtful in my view, because what we saw the last time around as well, was that not only tariffs put on imported goods, but the countries that face those tariffs put in tariffs of their own. In our case, it impacted the American farmer and the agriculture sector, which pays, on average, 17% more in wages than jobs in other sectors. I was just in Washington this week and met with the Agricultural Secretary, Tom Vilsack, who hosted a roundtable meeting with a number of farmers, growers, and associations, and that was our beat, trying to get as much of that export cargo moving, because more exports also are in favor of positive GDP, bringing down that trade gap a little bit. So this is quite an interesting situation, but safe to say the tariffs will impact the American consumer if it goes down this path.
And of course, if this happens, this would mean less cargo coming through the ports, you feel, of course, right?
Possibly so, but here's what happened so far, and with history on our side, as those tariffs were implemented against China manufactured goods, we started to see the migration of manufacturing, as I mentioned, but we've been nimble enough to chase that cargo and pick it up. The liner shipping companies have also been a partner in this. Speed has always been our selling point to the market. We can get from North Asia to the Midwest of the country faster through Los Angeles than anywhere else. So if we can get more nonstop services from the Southeast Asian nations, that speed component is still on our side.
That's very interesting as you put all that out. And you talk about speed. This is, of course, efficiency in logistics. This is part of it. Just talk a bit about the dwell times for the cargo, because this was the thing that we all became a little more aware of during the course of the supply chain issues. We were like, well, why are there bottlenecks? What are these supply chain issues? Speak a bit about how y'all are doing with dwell times.
Yeah, this has been really interesting. From July to October, Amrit, we moved more cargo than we did during the peak of 2021 or 2022, and without one ship backed up. Wow. You may remember back in 2022, we had 109 vessels off the coast of Long Beach and Los Angeles. Cargo was stacked to the gills, and it was all about velocity. If cargo sits for a long period of time, it gums up all the works for the rail, the truckers, the vessel operators. So we found through great collaboration, everyone was on deck. And those numbers, as far as how long a container sits at the Port of Los Angeles, is at or better than it was pre-COVID.
A lot of that depends on a reliable stream of cargo, and there's some volatility that could be coming down the pike with these tariffs, something I'm sure that you're keeping an eye on when it comes to logistics. Gene, before I let you go, let's also talk about the sustainability that you have there at the port when it comes to emissions and beyond. A lot of this is the EPA grants that come and have come from this Biden administration. You got the incoming Trump administration that may think a little differently about emissions or some of these grants and the EPA in general. How are you thinking about that, and what are we seeing with sustainability at the port?
These last 4 years, we've received more federal and state funding than ever in our history. The bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and Governor Newsom's work around ports in our state budget. As we move forward, this last grant by the Environmental Protection Agency, $412 million in new zero emissions projects. We're going to keep beating that same drum as the new administration comes in, talking about how for every 4 containers that come through the Port of Los Angeles, we create 1 job. And if we can do it cleaner, coming off our best year ever reducing pollution, that's where we want to keep going. So it's going to be a measured approach as we move forward.
Right, that's what I was about to say. When you're looking at this administration, the kinds of notes that they're intoning, you feel confident you'll continue to get that kind of support?
We're going to try our best.
All right, well, that's what we'll take them at that. And we're going to check in with you because it won't be long before we will have this new administration, and there'll be much to discuss. Gene Seroka, thanks so much for coming in. Great to speak with you.